All right, as I've gone into in the past couple videos, I believe the key to understanding Leave the World Behind is that the last one, Friends series finale, aired 2 days after a total lunar eclipse under a blood moon. And Donald Trump was born on June 14th, 1946, under a total lunar eclipse blood moon. Meaning, the last one, Friends episode, symbolically is Donald Trump being woven through what is portrayed in that film, which is the destruction of the United States of America via a cyber attack. In the context of the metaphor, that is what Donald Trump is doing as the twin 9/11 in the actual real world, he is woven throughout the so-called Great American Eclipse. He is the talisman that they are using to gravitationally pull everything towards him in a way where they can direct it in a way that shapes the future that they are envisioning. When you watch Leave the World Behind, the first scene after the credits shows the daughter character here on the screen with the NASA shirt watching the penultimate Friends episode in the series, the second to last one, where a character in the actual Friends show says something along the lines of, "Sorry boys, the ride is over," in reference to America, of course. But it's not an accident that she is the one that's wearing the NASA t-shirt. She is the character that is trying to see the last one throughout the entire film. And indeed, the very last scene is her pressing play on a remote control that is starting the last one episode, which essentially is metaphorically showing her detonating this symbolic subconscious programming in your mind's eye. In the same way that Christopher Nolan shows that nuclear device Sphere detonating at the end of The Dark Knight Rises. The detonation of that bomb in The Dark Knight Rises is the culmination of the terrorist attack. In other words, Donald Trump, via subliminal association with this episode of Friends, is woven throughout the entire film, Leave the World Behind. From the start to the finish, in the context of the destruction of America that is being portrayed in the film. In other words, Donald Trump is that episode of Friends. They are one and the same, based on the association between when each thing came into the world, you see. Both under a total lunar eclipse, blood moon, to the point where symbolically they could use that episode in the movie to represent Donald Trump's influence as it relates to the larger Great American Eclipse agenda. Now, first, looking at this image, a lot of people just went with the easiest interpretation, which is obey NASA, a subliminal command. And then you can take that one step further to the whole T minus thing. What is NASA minus a T? Well, it's Satan rearranged. In short, this image in a subconscious fashion is saying obey Satan. But I noticed something else along these lines when I was watching the footage of the eclipse on April 8th, 2024, which is the fact that the images that were coming through the live stream that I was watching in the United States of America were all provided by NASA. I don't know how it was in the rest of the world, if they sort of were given the same feed from NASA and labeled it as something else, or they put that little courtesy of NASA somewhere on the broadcast, but they don't actually show it on the screen like they did in America. For our live streams, this NASA image was on it the entire time that they covered the eclipse, from when it entered Mexico until it left Canada. Meaning, in the context of the Great American Eclipse ritual, that Donald Trump is infused into. This is a subconscious command throughout the entire film, Leave the World Behind, to obey NASA. Or just in general, when it's not this scene in particular, it's associating her and the Friends episode, which is Donald Trump, with NASA. And then when you're actually watching the feed of the eclipse, you are associating it with NASA. In other words, obey NASA, or obey the programming that we have placed into and embedded within this eclipse narrative. Obey NASA. Obey everything that we have programmed you with as it relates to the subconscious eclipse programming. I think this makes it a little more clear why she was wearing this NASA t-shirt throughout so much of the film. Yes, NASA was involved in the ritual in terms of the APEP rockets that they shot up there to study different things that were going on in the atmosphere while the eclipse was taking place. And that has all of the familiar Egyptian symbolism that NASA is very prone to using. But I think this is the real reason why she was wearing the NASA t-shirt, in the context of the fact that her character was desperate to see the last one, and indeed hit play on the episode, metaphorically hitting play on all of the programming that they put into Donald Trump in terms of the Great American Eclipse, 2017 to 2024, and that whole ritual. Because he is that episode in the context of the film symbolically. So it's obey NASA when everyone who wasn't in the path of totality was viewing the feed. The idea is obey NASA, obey all of the programming that we have put into your black hole pupil as it relates to this eclipse. And along those lines, it was fascinating to see the headlines that were put out about the eclipse after the fact. The first one that caught my eye here was from ABC News. Total eclipse captures hearts, minds of millions. Now really think about what they said there. Captures hearts and minds. That's not accidental phrasing. It seems innocent enough on the surface, but if you understand this larger ritual, you understand why they chose those words in particular. They want you associating this eclipse with captured hearts and minds. In that way, you subconsciously consent to that taking place because you do not object to it, because it's transpiring on a level that you are not aware of, at least consciously. Or let's say the majority of the population is not aware of it consciously. And you put the two together here and you get the idea. Obey NASA. NASA all over the feed of the eclipse. Obey capturing your heart and mind. Do you see how that all ties together? And it gets even more interesting because the night before the eclipse, on April 7th, 2024, Death to America was trending on Twitter. I took this screenshot when it was 17. I don't know how high it eventually got, but there were stories circulating around the internet about this thing trending, meaning it was big enough that a lot of people took notice of it. What are the odds in the context of the Great American Eclipse or the ritual destruction of America that the phrase death to America would go viral the night before the April 8th, 2024 eclipse? And it was in all of the breaking news stories on that day. This was the start of it on April 7th around 11 p.m. on the East Coast of the United States of America. But even if you go check today, this story is still making headlines. And I have that up here somewhere, where you can see as recently as 4 hours ago, this story is still out there circulating, to the point where even the White House had to comment on it. Now, because of the way the propaganda is working, this is a story that was covered more by Fox News and the quote-unquote conservative right, because it plays right into a lot of their natural talking points, where they're the ones telling the truth about the migrant crisis. They're the ones telling the truth about what's really going on in the country. Accordingly, a story like this, where Muslims in Michigan are chanting death to America, death to Israel, is something that they're going to focus on more than the other side would. Because this doesn't fit in the other side's narrative that these people aren't in any way against America and should be allowed into the country and we should take care of them, and the whole thing along those lines. But it got to the point where even the White House had to comment on it, and you can see this in an article of The Hill. White House condemns death to America chants at rally in Dearborn, Michigan. Biden's press secretary replied yes when asked if President Biden condemns the comments in the chants, which were captured on video by some attendees. Anyways, I hope you can see the incredible coincidence that transpired here, where the phrase death to America was being registered by minds all across the country right as this eclipse came and went. People are thinking death to America just by reading this story. They're associating the eclipse with death to America. That is neuro-linguistic programming. They have associated the total solar eclipse on April 8th, 2024 with the phrase death to America. And then subconsciously, those minds agree to America dying in the context of the larger ritual because they do not object to it. They were programmed with it and consented to it without their conscious knowledge. That was just a subconscious association that took place by all of those news stories with Death to America in the title being spammed everywhere at the same time that everyone is talking about this eclipse and totally immersed within it. Hearts and minds captured by the idea of death to America. Obey NASA. Do you understand and see how all of these phrases are working together all at the same time to give acceptance to the ritual destruction of America? With one of the main commands coming from a film that depicts that very thing happening in reality. And it's very interesting along those lines in the way that it's depicted in the film, where the phrase death to America is very clearly referenced at one point in the film. There are the flyers that a plane drops, and Ethan Hawke's character picks one of them up and brings it back. And his son, in terms of the character, says, oh, hey, I know what that one phrase means. It means death to America. And you have this Middle Eastern language on the screen in that context. One level to this is that no one knows who to blame within the film for what is happening. Which we find out later when Kevin Bacon's character is talking about how one of his contacts found a similar flyer that was in Korean or Chinese. And G.H.'s character explains that at one point, that this is part of a coup d'etat plan where you confuse the enemy from your perspective by giving them all of these options for who is doing what's happening and why it's happening. You confuse the target country into not knowing who to blame for why everything is taking place. And I hope you see the metaphor there in terms of this real life Death to America story where everyone can see that the United States is being intentionally brought down as a part of this ritual, this twin 9/11 terrorist attack spearheaded by Donald Trump, the Moonchild. Everyone can see that it's taking place, but they don't know who to blame. And they look to the media or any kind of news outlet, even down to just regular quote-unquote YouTube channels that tell you it's all a part of a plan, QAnon style. Everybody's looking for some explanation for why this is occurring. And one of the explanations that they are given is, oh, it's these immigrants or migrants that want to destroy America, and they are the reason that this is happening. So that's who I should blame. And from the perspective of the people that are distributing the propaganda, they know who is really behind the whole thing, but they give everyone a different explanation that they can potentially latch onto. In America, for those of you who don't live here, one side would say, oh, it's the deep state that's doing this. And the other side would say, oh, it's these domestic terrorist conspiracy theorists online that are causing this crisis in the country. Everyone has someone to blame depending on where their awareness is at, what level they are with all of this stuff. But given everything else that is in Leave the World Behind, what are the odds that Death to America is specifically referenced, and then we get the real life news story the night before the April 8th, 2024 eclipse? Well, we don't even have to worry about odds because we know that the director of this film was given the script. They said, hey, here's what we want you to do. This is the plan. Make a movie about it and make it metaphorical and symbolic and, don't be so overt with it, but, program the mind in a subliminal, subconscious way. That's what you were trained to do as a director in our school of directing. So yeah, they gave him the script and it has played out in so many different ways. And that's assuming that directors like the director of Leave the World Behind is even the one doing this in the first place. Life is complex and nuanced to the point where I'm sure there is a legitimate production surrounding all of these actors and the larger Hollywood apparatus that films everything. And if you talk to those people, they would say, oh, all of this is real. I know the director, and we've had conversations about these scenes here and there, and I know that it wasn't any kind of nefarious plan. Well, of course, that's going on under the surface of the whole thing, that there is this plausible explanation for things like there always is. But it wouldn't surprise me if these films were crafted with a science that we don't have access to, that combines some kind of computer learning system that constructs the scripts and the connections in a way that the director then films and is made the front man for whatever is doing this behind the scenes as a part of programs that we're not aware of. It could be something like that, or it could be a more innocent explanation where these directors are inducted into the society of filmmakers that make films to program people's minds. And they go to school to learn how to do that in the same way that the economists go to school to eventually sit on the Federal Reserve boards, but we know that they get the qualification to then produce a scripted outcome. The education is the alibi that they're just an economist that studies these things and does the best that they can given the coincidental circumstances that arise. That's a part of the plausible storyline, but also in that way, they need to go to school and get the doctorates as economists so that they can speak to other economists in that language, and it will make sense to them and sell the plausible storyline. So I think it could be similar with these directors, where they can speak the language of film, they can sell that they actually created the films, but then behind the scenes, they're just handed these things that were concocted by sorcerers we can't even imagine existing. I love bringing up this story about how there's speculation that these adepts along these lines, these sorcerers, are performing magic rituals on the actual main copy of the film or the music albums. They do rituals and infuse the master copies with a certain energy, and then that energy permeates through the screen when it's later reproduced and shown to everyone. And that's what I mean about subconscious programming. I mean, there could be stuff in these films that you can't even imagine. I mean, literally, you can't imagine it because you can't perceive it. And someone would have to tell you it's going on before you perceived it, or you would just have to be lucky enough to eventually figure out that's going on and see it for yourself. either way, in the context of obey NASA and this eclipse with the NASA on the screen, and then Death to America in the film as well, it is no coincidence that those news stories broke the night before the eclipse, because Donald Trump, as the twin of 9/11, is designed to bring about death to America via the Great American Eclipse, symbolically speaking. He's the insurgent in the White House, as the Economist cover showed. He's a domestic terrorist. He was the currency exchange that switched from the war on terror and foreign terrorists to domestic, homegrown terrorists. And it's hilarious, speaking of neuro-linguistic programming, because what does Donald Trump do? He comes in a red MAGA hat and says, we're going to make America great again. We're going to save it. Meanwhile, he's being used to destroy it, while people think that they're attaching themselves to something that is going to do the opposite of what it is intended to do. And that is the currency exchange, you see. It's almost like a martial art trick, where you let somebody's energy come into you and you redistribute it back through your body into them, and it causes them to fall down. Do you see how that is kind of the movement that they're doing here with this propaganda that is on the internet? Hey, we know that there's going to be a lot of backlash to this multicultural, multipolar new world order that we are creating here. We know we are going to alter lifestyles in a dramatic way, and we're going to alter what people think is possible in a dramatic way. That's going to cause a reaction naturally. People are going to be upset, anxious, fearful. They're going to want to do something to stop it. So we give them the talisman. We give them the moonchild that they can attach their energy to. They can give their energy into it in a very literal way. Have it be pulled out of them. The water in their body slowly gravitating towards, synchronizing with the ebb and flow of the tide that is Donald Trump, to the point where he can eventually direct it in any way that he wants, which we saw on January 6th when he was able to direct the water towards the Capitol building. He was able to get a bunch of dupes who didn't understand what was going on to go to that event and eventually be arrested, some of them. So they take collective energy, channel it into something else, and then put it back on you and use it for their agenda in the process, and totally neutralize it as a threat to the larger system at the same time. And then the New York Times had a similar headline: total solar eclipse concludes dark path through North America. Pay attention to the words again. Concludes dark path. Captures hearts and minds. Obey NASA. Obey NASA. Death to America. Put all of that together, right? Obey NASA. Obey the Eclipse programming that we have embedded into this whole thing in so many different ways. Allow us to capture your heart and mind with the idea of death to America being associated with this ritual. And just like that, you have acquired the consent for the ritual to continue in the way that it has started. You have allowed death to America symbolically to come into being. And this death to America story fits right into that on one layer. Like I said, there are so many layers to it, but on one layer, the news stories all focused on death to America and death to Israel. And that's a great example of the ritual destruction of America in the realm of the mind. Post-World War II, America had unlimited capital as the moral authority, based on what it was attributed to having done in World War II. America turned the tide to defeat evil Hitler, and then they dropped the bombs on Japan that ended the war. So they, in effect, saved the world from World War II and total destruction, or from even worse, a Third Reich run world. So America has all of this capital that it can wield throughout the world, and no one is really questioning it because, yeah, they did a great thing and they allow freedom in their society in a way that we don't. So maybe we should allow America to kind of meddle around the world and try to help give other countries what America has. And then right after that, the ritual destruction of America begins, right? Because they don't want that kind of thing to be in existence. Some shining example of freedom and prosperity and community. They don't want that to be a thing. So they take control of it and do the same thing, right? They start with the co-opting of the anti-Vietnam War protest that had begun because they were starting to run out of the capital. This was in the 1960s, 20 years after World War II. There had already been a Korean War, and people were starting to look around and say, hey, yeah, we have this moral authority, but we're over in Vietnam doing something that we shouldn't be doing. This is ridiculous. And that movement was growing, and then, boom, they came out with this 60s counterculture hippie movement that co-opted the anti-war movement and turned it into this psychedelic revolution, which was then combined with the feminist revolution to begin wearing on the nuclear family and the integrity of communities in general. And then into the 70s and 80s, they flood the streets with crack and cocaine, and they start that black budget drug running scheme, which is all a part of Iran-Contra eventually, which then bleeds into the promotion of gangster rap and how hip-hop would eventually become the dominant culture, programming everyone's minds with what is acceptable, how we should act, what is the cultural zeitgeist along those lines. And you look at the lyrics to all of those songs and you're creating little soldiers who are very materially focused on the same things promoted by rock and roll, sex, drugs, and the vibration that those controlled bands produce. And we know going back to the 60s that the same thing was going on then through the Laurel Canyon stuff, where all of these famous artists that we think are these transformative bands have these ties back to the military. Jim Morrison's father is Admiral Morrison, just to name one example. And then you have the Beatles tied into Tavistock and their artificial creation. And you just see the way the culture was shifted to turn it into something else along those lines. And we're witnessing just an extension of that now. It's the same thing going on, and I think people forget that when they're looking at this stuff, and they forget when they're looking at somebody on YouTube who is supposedly fighting against what is happening. They forget that these people have been scripted from the beginning to be put out there as the thing that I was talking about with Donald Trump, the way they absorb your energy, then turn it back around on you, as a martial artist would, without ever delivering a blow themselves. They use your energy against you. And in that way, they avoid any type of liability. But along those lines, pay attention to how death to America and death to Israel are now so inextricably linked, due to what America is portrayed as having given to the state of Israel. And Israel has lost so much political capital through what they have done to Gaza that the whole entire world is turning against Israel, and by default, they are turning against the United States in a very fundamental way. The United States now has no political capital whatsoever. It's completely vanished now, based on their support of what Israel is doing in the Middle East. And that started with 9/11/2001. That was an example of a Pearl Harbor, which they wrote about in the PNAC document, an event that allows political capital to form where you justify a war that otherwise would not be justifiable. And we got tricked as Americans into supporting that at the time because we thought 9/11 was an organic event that just happened, attacked by terrorists. Okay, yeah, let's go take care of this. We all got duped by that for the most part. And we exhausted a lot of American political capital in those wars over in the Middle East. And at the same time, contrived whistleblowers like Julian Assange, Edward Snowden, Bradley Manning, all of these people are leaking sensitive information about what America is doing all over the world. And then you have the alternative media, quote unquote, that is controlled opposition as well, that is exposing what the CIA is doing all across the world and what they have been doing for decades. And I'm not excusing that. I'm just trying to get you to see the bigger picture here. Because ultimately, the same people run every country. Okay? Each country is a franchise with very limited exceptions. And we see what happens to the limited exceptions when they go against the larger agenda. But the major players are all franchises of the same corporation. And America's political capital now is at an all-time low, possibly in the negative, to the point where collectively, in terms of the whole world, the idea of death to America seems very legitimate. Like something that should happen. Hey, yes, I agree. America should not be able to exist anymore. And in that way, what is going on right now is contributing to the ritual destruction of America. This is happening on many different levels and in many different ways that are more than just something overt like it was depicted in Leave the World Behind. Though I'm sure more of those overt events like the Key Bridge collapse are coming in this window in time. But you got to see how it's happening in all kinds of different realms as well. Some of which relate to the subconscious realm of the mind. And there probably wasn't a better example of that than the political ad that Donald Trump ran on the morning of April 8th, 2024, which on the surface level was actually pretty funny in the way that they portrayed his head eclipsing the sun. But in the context of the moon child, it takes on a whole different element. When they show you Donald Trump's head eclipsing the sun as the moonchild eclipse baby born under a total lunar eclipse blood moon, you now have the literal corona around Donald Trump's head. Corona is crown. And you also have Donald Trump's imagery in terms of the eclipse here associated with all the other stuff that was going on that day with Obey, NASA, and the eclipse, Captured Hearts and Minds, Death to America, Dark Path. All of that neurolinguistic programming associated with Obey NASA, that subconscious subliminal command. Obey our programming as it relates to Death to America and our moonchild eclipse baby, Donald Trump. Out of time. The end of the world. Leave the world behind. The quantum leap of consciousness, as exemplified by the monolith at the United Nations Ground Zero, Donald Trump World Tower, in the same vicinity as the United Nations monolith, where he is the Dark Tower, the portal to consciousness making contact with their programming along these lines. And of course, this political ad played the score from 2001: A Space Odyssey. So they associated it with that movie because of course they would. He's the twin 9/11, and 9/11 2001 via the monolith at Ground Zero is likewise associated with 2001: A Space Odyssey. So the twin of 9/11, Donald Trump, has this ad that runs on April 8th, 2024, the day of the total solar eclipse, where he's the literal moon eclipsing the sun, played to the music from 2001: A Space Odyssey, which just ties the whole thing together, right? And subconsciously, they have programmed everyone's mind with the idea that this represents death to America, and subconsciously you have agreed to it in terms of the larger Great American Eclipse ritual. This is why Donald Trump, as the twin 9/11, was coordinated to be the president of the United States during the COVID-19 pandemic. Because he is the coronavirus in the context of their agenda, symbolically speaking. He is the pandemic that needs to be ended in order for democracy to survive. Because Trump is just emblematic of all the controlled opposition figures that they have put all across the world along these lines. There are far-right conspiracy theorists and pro-nationalists in every country that is being subjected to this agenda in terms of the United Nations multicultural, multipolar world government structure. He is Operation Warp Speed, which culminated with the first non-trial mRNA vaccine being administered on December 14th, 2020, the date of a total solar eclipse, right in between the 2017 and 2024 total solar eclipses. And then a few weeks later, there is this staged attack on the U.S. Capitol, this quote-unquote insurrection. Donald Trump is the coronavirus. He's the pandemic. And by using him in this way, it produces warp speed, or the quantum jump into that new reality. It's the wormhole to that point, making contact with the propaganda subconsciously that will eventually shape this new vision of the world. Not only was Donald Trump the twin 9/11, but COVID-19 was the twin 9/11, except on a worldwide stage. I mean, you really got to remember what they accomplished in terms of controlling people's minds during that pandemic. When you look back at what they got people to do, it's awe-inspiring. As it relates to worldwide coordination, everyone getting the same propaganda all at the same time and coordinating responses in a worldwide way, and everyone following the same guidelines in a worldwide perspective. So the number one lesson from all of this stuff is to be very protective of your energy and where you allow it to be directed. When you're viewing stuff on the internet or on the news or just having conversations with people, be very mindful of how something is trying to redirect your energy into a cause or an idea, whatever shape it takes, whatever form it takes. Be mindful of your energy and don't give it away so that it can be redirected into something that is ultimately trying to achieve the opposite of what you intended to send your energy towards. This is the cube. The fourth dimensional tesseract that the cube becomes when you add a dimension to its third dimensional shape. Warp speed, the wormhole, quantum leap, the Stargate, the coronavirus, the Moonchild, capturing hearts and minds, death to America, obey NASA. Obey NASA. Hopefully I did a good job of making that make sense. So that's it for now. Later.